And with that, I will hand it over to tonight's presenters, Tim and Sarah, who will talk to us about local news. Thank you both. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's really great to be with you. And I'm Tim. This is Sarah. We really just wanted to start tonight by thanking you for this opportunity to talk to you this evening and be with you this evening and answer your questions. And I also wanted to commend you for all the work that you've been doing and the innovation in using technology and data to address some of the biggest issues facing the city and the state. So thanks for caring enough. Thank you for being civically engaged. And thank you for your interest in local news here tonight. So thanks for being with us. Sarah, did you want to say anything before we dive in?
Yeah, I want to second what Tim said in terms of thanks for having us, for your interest. And also, if you need any data afterward, please feel free to reach out. We're going to include the links to our websites, and we'd be happy to share any additional data that you might want access to for any of the great work you're doing.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And we have a bit of a presentation that we want to walk through. And then we will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I wanted to start off tonight by talking a little bit about the Medill Local News Initiative, just to give you some context and perspective around what it is that we're doing here at Medill around local news. So we founded the Local News Initiative about 6 years ago because we could see that the local news industry was collapsing, that it was in crisis. And we also very acutely understand the profound impacts that a loss of local news can have on communities, that it can have ultimately on the state of our democracy. So I'm proud to say that at Northwestern, we decided to tackle this challenge head on and use the research expertise and the faculty expertise that we have here at Medill to basically create an R&D area at the school that is really focused on local news and trying to help local news, both in terms of providing new insights and information, understanding about local news, but also then helping news organizations directly in taking action to try to help them. So, the goal is really to be a leader in local news research and development at a time of crisis in local news. We want to and are discovering new insights about the state of local news. You'll hear about some of those in a minute. We also want to leverage the expertise that we have here at the school to help local news organizations that are in crisis. We're turning our research and our data-driven findings into action by working with local news leaders on strategies for audience engagement, product development, long-term financial sustainability. We're providing world-class training opportunities for local news leaders, journalists, and students. Just a couple of hours ago, I left our first Medill Innovation and Leadership Academy. We're hosting 16 news leaders from Chicago, current news leaders and up-and-coming news leaders in the city, in a week-long immersive program to help them help their news organizations to grow and become sustainable. It's been a very inspiring event this week that runs through Friday. We also want to be a trusted collaborator with policymakers and industry leaders on some of the issues facing local news. And I'll be talking about some of the work that we just completed with the Illinois Local Journalism Task Force here in the state. And we want to help instigate action by making our research and programs accessible and visible to the community. This is a list of the various projects that we have going as part of the Medill Local News Initiative. Sarah is going to be talking to you about the State of Local News Project, which is probably our most visible work that we do here at Medill. We also just founded earlier this year with the help of a grant from the McCormick Foundation here in Chicago, the Medill Local News Accelerator. So we select cohorts of news organizations in the Chicagoland area, and we do research with them, and then we develop projects with them and work with them on specific either new products or on business strategy. And that's been an incredibly rewarding program, and I hope helpful to the news organizations involved. I mentioned the Leadership Academy, which is going on now this week here at Medill. We also have the Medill Engagement Index. We have 107 local news organizations from around the country that have given us their reader data, their subscriber data, some of the revenue data. And then we take that, we built a new tool with the help of a Google Innovation Grant, and we help local news organizations see how they're performing with digital readers, and then they can benchmark with their peers across the country. And this is a tool that we make available for free to local news outlets. We're also the home of the Midwest Solutions Journalism Hub, which we also founded earlier this year. So we're working with news organizations across the 5-state area on the craft of solutions journalism, which is a trend in the industry and which we hope will help make news even more relevant and useful to communities. We also started a couple of years ago a program we call Teach for Chicago Journalism. We believe that the future of journalism starts in high schools with students and helping them to become inspired and to seek careers in journalism. So we're working directly with CPS schools and with other schools throughout the Chicagoland area to try to help grow the journalism programs in those schools. And we also started this fall a pilot program for an advanced placement course in journalism, which we believe to be perhaps the first in the nation to do that. And our Medill Local News Initiative website, which if you Google Medill Local News Initiative, you will find is generating a ton of traffic now. And we have lots of articles there on trends in the local news industry, as well as recent research on local news, including research that we're doing here at Medill. So this is the number of people that we have working on the local news initiative here at the school. It's a total of 30. There's a look at the team members, which includes faculty, staff, researchers, some contractors, all here at the school that are dedicated to this project. And most importantly, up in the corner is Charles Whitaker, who's the dean of Medill, who's been very engaged and been a champion of this project here at the school. So now Sarah is going to talk to you about the State of Local News Project, and we may jump in and help each other out here as we go along. But Sarah, why don't you take it away?
Great, thanks so much. So Sarah Stondley, I am the newish, fairly new director of the State of Local News Project, taking over for Penny Abernathy, who has basically, she began the State of Local News Project in 2016 at UNC, brought it to Medill a few years ago, and it's only grown since. And really what at the heart of the State of Local News Project is our annual report, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, the findings from which are, used by philanthropy and academics and policymakers to really get a handle on what's happening across the country with local news and information at the county level. So it really has become sort of an invaluable tool. And I can say that as one who is on the other side of it, using it for several years before now, sort of helping to lead it. So really exciting to talk about that with you here today. This sort of sets the stage, sort of, talks about the stakes, right? What are the stakes of local journalism? What happens when we don't have it? What is it really? Why do we care? And this is a quote from the Knight Commission. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation is one of the big funders of journalism around the country, and they played a huge role in sort of bringing this crisis to the public consciousness and helping to drive solutions. So I'll just read it with you. At its best, journalism informs the public on matters of civic concern, gives citizens a common set of facts, provides context that lends greater meaning to the news, independently monitors and holds those in power accountable, and strengthens the public discourse. Good journalism helps us to understand others whose lives and challenges are very different from our own. So clearly a lot in that quote, but really kind of is easy to forget. What is journalism for? Not only the watchdog function, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, but also sort of providing that cohesive glue for communities and people who, might not think alike or, live the same way. But really, local journalism at its very best helps people understand each other, I think, on a fundamental level. So without local news, and we've had several years now of really good, robust research from various academic fields, political science, sociology, economics, communication, certainly, that has shown, what happens. And there have been, unfortunately, very, very high number of natural experiments. In other words, places that have lost local news outlets entirely that people have been able to look at, sort of compare before and after data and see all sorts of negative ripple effects when a community loses sort of its last local news outlet. So voter participation declines, corruption and taxes increase. There's a great study that's cited all the time showing that municipal bond or municipal borrowing, the rates get higher, which is sort of like not the intuitive outcome that you might expect, but sort of correlated it directly to the loss of local news. Misinformation and disinformation flourish in the vacuum that's left when local outlets disappear, because people still want local information. They're still hungry for it. So they find it in places like social media where there's not an editor vetting, and anyone can sort of just say whatever they want. So there's all sorts of negative effects when local news goes away.
Just to add to that quickly, I was giving a talk, something akin to this a couple months back, and somebody said, so what does it matter if there's no local news in a community? And I said two words, George Soros.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm thinking of the congressman in Long Island, George Santos, not George
Santos.
Soros. George Santos, thank you. But that was a case where the local press in Long Island and in New York didn't do a background check. And so George Santos ends up elected to Congress. There was a small weekly, I think, that did raise some questions about his background, but none of the other papers picked it up as they might have when they were fully staffed. And so George Santos gets elected to Congress, and we kind of all know the rest.
Right.
Of the story. And I also had somebody who once described this problem as, if you think about journalists as traffic cops. And so, if you're driving down I-55 and there are no traffic cops, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but you might speed. But if there are traffic cops, you're probably going to hew pretty close to the speed limit. So, journalists play that kind of a role in terms of watchdogging government. And that's why when there are no journalists, that sometimes bad things happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what did we find in the 2023 report? Again, it's a national report. We look at the county level. And we looked this year at newspapers, dailies and weeklies specifically. So this is specifically local news. We do not include like national outlets like the New York Times or Washington Post, which has become, sort of one of the national outlets, USA Today. It's local papers publishing on like a daily or weekly basis. We looked at digital natives. So we looked at online only. We looked at ethnic media, and we looked at public broadcasting as well. And we found that there are 204 counties that have 0 news outlets, local news outlets, covering them. So these are, again, like Tim said, sort of municipal elections that are happening where no one's covering them. Judges are being elected, tax dollars are being spent. No one's paying any attention to how that happens, or if they are, they're not journalists who are trained to ask the questions and report back. There are over 1,500 of the more than 3,000 counties that have only one outlet. And those are the light blue. So you can see they're kind of concentrated in the Plains states, sort of directly north from Texas, and in the south And of course, a lot of the outlets, a lot of the counties, that you're seeing in blue are very low population, right? So they're very sparsely populated, but a lot of them are not, especially in the South and on the East Coast and in Texas. So, this is a case where it's like one outlet covering, in some cases, a vast amount of space. And then there are some areas that are doing pretty well, and you can see them in the dark blue. Those are there are some counties that have a really robust local news ecosystem, Cook County being one of them. So it really varies, but I think seeing it on a national map really puts it sort of in plain view. Just to sort of step back briefly, this report, as I said, was the brainchild of Penny Abernethy, and it's been published since 2016. So it was 2016, 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2022. And U.S. News Deserts is the website for the reports that were published out of UNC. The URL below it is the website for the local news reports that have been published out of Northwestern. And the 2023 report is there as well. Just really quick while I'm thinking of it, we do have some other offerings from the State of Local News Project, and we're hoping to expand them. I'm going to be starting a quarterly newsletter. We have research insight features where we choose a different researcher, usually an academic, every month, and we interview them and we post their profile online. Always someone who's done some research either directly to do with local journalism or directly adjacent. So we have those. We have, as Tim said, sort of all these other different news outlets or news offerings. And it's really a place where we try to really stay on top of what's happening in the local journalism landscape, both in this country and abroad, because there's a lot of interesting stuff. Oh, and media policy. The policy element is huge, which we'll talk about in a second. So since 2005, so Penny started the first report in 2016, but the data that they collected went back to 2005 because that was the last sort of normal year for the local journalism landscape, and normal meaning like at sort of as we knew it in the legacy era of the 20th century. So really up until 2005, newspaper stocks were like in high demand, regularly returning rates of 20% profit. The internet had not really affected the business model yet at all. So that's why our data goes to 2005, sort of to compare and make a longitudinal data set that can be comparative as well. So we have lost an immense number of newspapers. Almost a third of the newspapers that we had in 2005 are gone. So that's, as you can see the numbers here, just thousands and thousands of newspapers. And again, this is why we have 1,500 one-outlet counties in this country. And likewise with newspaper employment. So again, these numbers, they're from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we have them to 2022, and it's just for newspapers, although it has gotten more granular in the last year. But you can see here the number of jobs lost in newsrooms, and it goes everyone from administration to accounting, all of these jobs that are sort of around the newspaper reporter and editor have also been lost as newspapers have shut down. So really a huge loss. And just to sort of one little anecdote, I worked at a place in New Jersey prior to Northwestern, and there was a big job cut by Gannett, and 20 people were fired from this local newsroom, sort of large, like a large local news, Asbury Park Press, I think it was. And the people they fired first were the ones who had been there the longest because they costed the most. But we went around and interviewed them, and they were also the ones who had the most institutional knowledge of the school board, of the municipal board, of the people in power, of the, who do you talk to if the garbage doesn't come or whatever, or garbage doesn't get picked up. So it's just really, that's also what's lost. It's not just the jobs and the incomes, it's like the institutional knowledge of how the community works and who you talk to if you have a problem type of thing. So all of this has resulted in news deserts. It's a pretty common term at this point. We define it as a community, either urban or rural, where residents have very limited access to credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy at the grassroots level and nurtures communities. So This is not being able to find, again, like who's running for your town board or the judgeship or whatever, or not being able to find information about sort of basic municipal functions or cultural events that are happening, having a really hard time getting any of that information. So these are news deserts. And then by the same token, there are news oases, as I mentioned, where, very vibrant, robust local news ecosystems do exist as well. We ran the numbers. It's one of the benefits of having a national data set is that you can, run numbers and be pretty confident that they're sort of statistically accurate. News deserts, as you can see, have a much lower median household income, a much lower percentage of people with a bachelor's degree or higher. They tend to be older, slightly older. And almost 17% of the population in these counties are on average below the poverty line. So it's usually not just that they're without a local news outlet. There's a whole sort of confluence of issues, as you would imagine, that occur in these communities. So one of the things we added this year to the report, which is very exciting, is a watch list. So I mentioned there are 204 counties that are news deserts, and there are slightly more than 1,500 that have only one outlet. Of those 1,500, there are 228 counties that share structural and demographic profiles similar to the news deserts. And those are the 228 that are on our watch list. And you can see here, we have the deserts and the watch list mapped here. So you can kind of see like a lot of them are adjacent, which is not super surprising. But again, like, we talked about the poverty rate and the median household income and the education attainment level. A lot of these counties, all of these counties that are on the 228 are sort of demographically similar and still have an outlet, but it's probably like hanging by a thread because of the similar factors.
Yeah, and not to go too deeply into the rabbit hole on this, but we were able to do this because of a data science team and the journalism faculty here at Northwestern, which crunched a whole bunch of data about the demographic and economic characteristics of current news deserts, and then how they applied to current one news source counties to create this watch list. So there was a ton of months worth of work and data crunching that went into this. So anyway,
Yeah.
Sarah.
I would also say, thank you, Tim. I would also say it's exciting because, there is currently a lot of philanthropic attention being paid to the problem of news deserts and local journalism in crisis. So we're hopeful that, the watch list can sort of, point attention in the directions of those places that still do have their local news outlets, and maybe like support those outlets. Because one of the other things we found, which I don't think we have a slide on here, but is that, digital outlets, which tend to be, can be great, digital natives, digital only outlets can be great, but it's really difficult for them to build any sort of brand recognition in the community because they're not on people's front porches. They're not in the grocery store, right? They're online only. So it usually is the case that if there is a surviving local news outlet, it would be nice to sort of help that one be, sustainable again. If it's not, then, sort of start a news digital outlet from scratch.
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great point. And the hope is that community leaders in these counties, that philanthropists in these counties can proactively take action now before these counties become a news desert. So that's why we wanted to do this. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the digital outlets. 90% of the digital outlets that we found are in metro areas, and we're pretty confident this is like pretty comprehensive list. 550 was the number, roughly 550 digital outlets that we mapped and analyzed. And as you can see, they're heavily concentrated on the East Coast, on the West Coast, Chicago, and sort of all the places where you would expect, where you have sort of metropolitan areas. So it's really not that the digital outlets are able to very easily replace those newspapers when they're lost, which are often like decades or even like hundreds of years old, in many cases.
Right.
Ethnic media outlets is the same. Again, maybe not super surprising, but like concentrated in the cities and the metro areas, concentrated where there are immigrant communities, where there are other than English language communities. And those are going to be, again, sort of not, not finding the population radius that the newspapers used to have. And public radio. We were excited to add public radio. Actually, we added public radio and public television. Public radio is mapped here. And again, as you can see, they do reach a large percentage of people, public radio stations, and they're not all NPR. Some of it is American Public Media, they do reach a large number of people, especially people who, for whatever reason, aren't going to be reading a newspaper or going online. Radio is super valuable in that respect, but they get such a small percentage of the public dollars that are given to Corporation for Public Broadcasting that they're just not able to add enough staff to really have the reach that they might otherwise, or have the depth of coverage that they might otherwise. And I think Tim is going to talk about Illinois now, specifically. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I really, for this audience especially, wanted to talk a little bit about Illinois and the local news situation here in the state, because Illinois has been especially hard hit by this local news crisis. Illinois has lost 85% of its newspaper journalists since 2005, since this research began. That is the highest percentage loss of any state in the nation. So I think that shows the depth of this problem in Illinois. And the question is why? And I think that there are a number of reasons. We've seen a lot of consolidation of local news organizations in the state, and when that happens, that leads to loss of jobs in local news organizations. And we've also seen, especially outside Chicago, the large chains have really taken over a big chunk of the state, and there have been a lot of costs that they've wringed out of those publications, a lot of regionalizing of news. So that has led to the loss of jobs as well. And then, of course, there's just the secular decline in the economics of newspapers that's contributing to this too. Illinois lost 36% of its newspapers, or 232. Illinois lost 232 newspapers, which is about the same as the nation. About a third of Illinois newspapers have disappeared. And then, some people have said to me, and Sarah, you probably heard this too, well, this is a rural problem. That the local news crisis really is in rural America. But, according to our statistics, about half of the losses of local newspapers have been in the Chicagoland area. And just earlier today, Zach Metzger, who's one of our terrific researchers on this project, pulled the losses by county. And what we saw there was DuPage County, fairly affluent, fairly upscale county west of Chicago, has lost 66%, 2/3 of its newspapers since 2005. Lake County, Illinois, another fairly affluent county just north of us here in Evanston, also has lost about 2/3 of its newspapers since 2005. So even though the news deserts per se are predominantly in rural areas, these losses are happening everywhere, and including in cities. So just wanted to make that point. Illinois has 4 news desert counties: Pulaski, Hamilton, Alexander, and Edwards, all down in southern Illinois. There are 4 additional counties that are on the watch list in Illinois: Brown, Gallatin, Hardin, and Pope counties. And there are 33 counties in all that have only one news source. So this is not as big of a problem as this is nationally. It's also very much hit home here in Illinois. So just a little bit of context, and I know we're starting to run up against time, but so you're probably asking, well, how the heck did this happen? And basically, the digital revolution shifted readers away from print to smartphones and PCs, as everyone in this audience knows. Print advertisers fled to digital, but not to digital newspapers' sites. And Google, Meta, and Amazon, 3 companies, are basically hoovering up about 2/3 of all the new digital ad revenue, and that's just not leaving much for local news organizations. And so why is that advertising important? It's important because 10, 12 years ago, 80% of all the revenue for a local news organization came from advertising. It was the primary pillar that propped up local news, and that pillar has now crashed. And so that's a big problem. A major chunk of those ad losses came from the loss of classified advertising. If you think about it, as archaic as this may seem now, you used to look for a job or a house or a car or for yard sales in newspapers, not on Craigslist or Cars.com or Zillow or name your website. And so not all, much of that advertising has fled to other sites. And then home delivery circulation of print newspapers used to be a pretty consistent revenue stream for local news organizations. And obviously that's in decline as well. Now, about a quarter of all news sites of all dailies are owned by just 10 companies, and there's the list. Gannett by far being the largest in terms of number of outlets. And there, number two, you see Alden Global Capital, which is the owner of the Chicago Tribune here in the city. Now, not all of the news, as Sarah was indicating, is gloomy. There are a number of local news bright spots around the country. This was a new feature that we added with this 2023 report. And so we highlight kind of 17 local news organizations around the country. There are the blue stars that are highlighted there that are innovating and finding new ways and finding new models to sustain local news. And you see the one blue star there in Chicago, and Block Club Chicago was one of our 17 bright spots around the country. And I so admire what they've been able to do. An organization not run by rich people, but by journalists who through their own entrepreneurship and diligence and smarts have in basically 5 years grown Block Club Chicago into a powerhouse that's providing coverage in neighborhoods in the city that heretofore really were not getting a lot of coverage. So Block Club right here in our own city is definitely one of the bright spots. I think one of the major success stories nationally for digital news sites in the last 5 years. So here's also some reason for optimism. There are some legacy news organizations that are pivoting from that advertising business model that we talked about to a reader revenue business model. That means digital subscriptions and memberships. So they're growing that revenue and trying to scale it for their communities and to build news organizations. We have seen some modest growth in nonprofit and digital-only local news sites. I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming up in future years. So that's good. The problem is those sites are not coming fast enough to replace what's being lost. We're seeing record philanthropic support, which is so encouraging. The MacArthur Foundation here in Chicago announced just a couple of months ago a campaign called Press Forward, in which they and a consortium of 22 other foundations are contributing $500 million to local news over the next 5 years. And I believe that consortium is only going to grow, and they hope that will be $1 billion over the next 5 years. And then we're also seeing growing public policy solutions around the country, especially at the state level. So according to Rebuild Local News, a nonprofit organization that tracks this stuff, there were 13 states that had either passed or were considering legislation to try to help local news. I'm happy to say that Illinois is about to become the 14th state to consider legislation to help local news. Just last week, the bipartisan local journalism task force, of which I was a member, published its report on the state of local news here in Illinois. And there were a number of suggested policy solutions for the legislature and the governor to take a look at. I won't go through all these in detail, but they included things like tax credits, either for people to subscribe to local news outlets or for small businesses to advertise in local news. Also tax credits for local news organizations themselves to hire local journalists to help fill some of that void that we've been talking about. There's also suggested an advertising set aside so that money that local government or state government was going to spend anyway on advertising would go to local community news outlets. They're also, and this is a case in New Jersey where Sarah is currently sitting, that created a grant program for local news organizations there. And then there also is discussion about trying to get big tech, namely Meta and Google, to compensate local news organizations for their content online, which would obviously be pretty controversial, but is something that's being talked about. And finally, there's a QR code where you can find the Mid-Atlantic State of Local News Report. There's the URL for the website where you can get more information, and we hope you do. And I think we are right at about 7:45, maybe a minute over. And with that, we will stop sharing the screen, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you both so much for this very informative and somewhat depressing, but I appreciate the notes of optimism at the end there. We did have a bunch of questions in the chat, so I will try to get to some of those. One of the early questions was they mentioned that the newspaper where they grew up only has one reporter left, and you kind of mentioned the loss of jobs as well as the loss of outlets. But when you look at those kind of outlets that might be at risk of closing, do you consider their staffing level as part of that risk? And like, do you look at outlets that are like shrinking in terms of staffing as a risk factor?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad it was asked. So as bad as the closure of outlets are, and as bad as the local news crisis is, it's actually even worse than we're portraying it by the loss of outlets, because we believe there are hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000, what we call ghost newspapers. So these are newspapers that are kind of in name only, but they're not generating any local content. And in some cases, believe it or not, actually have no local journalists working in their communities. So that's actually something that we hope to do more research on as part of our State of Local News Report. Sarah's got a lot of good ideas for how we can do that. But that's an important question, and it's one that we need to do more research on. I know, Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, I was also glad to hear the question, because it does point to the problem of ghost newspapers. And not only is there only, sometimes one reporter left at an outlet, but there will be one reporter covering, 7 counties or something like that, based in the state capital or whatever, but then, sort of purportedly covering all these different, areas that are hundreds or tens of miles away. So that unfortunately is largely the result of the conglomerate and hedge fund ownership that Tim pointed to earlier.
Another question that I had and was kind of gestured at in one of the questions in the chat was about the scope of what you're including. Like, it sounded like you did not necessarily include television local news, like, our ABC and Fox. I'm just curious if you can speak that on. Someone else kind of asked about like other radio stations. For example, like, folks might think about like kind of conservative talk radio, and like I'm just curious, like, have you looked into any of those other kinds of news sources, or thought about how they kind of factor into this picture?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion about local commercial television news. So here's the issue with that. I mean, what we're looking at is local kind of community-based news and information. So these are outlets that are covering, as Sarah was saying, the local school board, the local city council, local zoning meetings, local businesses, things like that. So let's just take WLS in Chicago as an example. There are 100 suburbs in Chicago. WLS doesn't have the airtime or the staff to possibly cover all 100 of those Chicago suburbs. And so you take that on a scale in all the metro markets around the country, and local television news simply isn't equipped to cover local news in that way, or to be a watchdog for local communities in the same way. So look, they do important work They do a lot of really terrific investigative work in some cases. So it's not a knock on them. It's just that that's just not something that they can practically do. That said, we would like to do more research on local television news. And I should say quickly that I think local television news is headed for the same kind of disruption, maybe not as severe, but the same kind of disruption as local newspapers. We're seeing cord cutting happening on a massive scale. It's accelerating. That is going to lead to loss of revenue to local commercial stations in the sub fees that they get from cable companies. So I think local television news is also headed into a bit of a rocky time.
Yeah, I would just add to that briefly by saying that sort of the methodological question is one that we get a fair amount because people will say like, well, I have this newspaper near me or this television outlet and like it's not in your database. We have a relatively strict definition, but again, just to really very briefly reiterate, trying to really just capture like that community journalism that is taking place with actual journalists in the community, going to the events, knowing about the community. But yes, like Tim said, television would be nice to include. We did include public television because they do tend to have sort of a smaller footprint. And they do tend to have more reporters because of the nature of the funding. But one of the ways that we want to look at television is the same kind of maybe the same method we want to apply to ghost newspapers, which is to do some sort of content analysis, which is kind of the natural next step of the work that we do sort of already to map the outlets.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Um, Another question, you mentioned kind of the consolidation among like companies that are owning a lot of outlets. I'm curious, have you all looked into trends of like wealthy individuals buying papers? I mean, we had the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos, and then the recent um news over at the Baltimore Sun. I guess I'm just curious, have you looked at that at all? And does that have any impact in at like on those outlets and their kind of trajectory, I guess?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I'm glad it was asked. I think there was a sense like a few years ago that if there were just a few billionaires that would buy up these local news organizations, that kind of all the problems would be solved, and we could go on producing local news kind of like we had before. And the New York Times actually just had a story about this last weekend. And I think what we're seeing is that even the billionaires who have acquired news organizations are experiencing the same economic headwinds as everyone else. Just today, the Los Angeles Times, which is owned by Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, um, announced a massive layoff. I think it was 20% of the newsroom is getting cut in LA. The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, had buyout of journalists. I forget the exact number, but it was a number of them just a few months ago. It's not a panacea to be owned by a billionaire. Does it help? Yeah, absolutely. But it's not necessarily an answer to coming up with a systemically viable business model. I will say that, we talked about the local news bright spots map, that there are a couple of examples of very wealthy people owning regional newspapers that have helped figure it out. So the Boston Globe, for example, one of the best regional papers in the country, owned by John Henry, the owner of the Boston Red Sox, is doing great work. They've really figured out a digital subscription strategy that works. And they're going gangbusters, and they now seem to be on terra firma. Pretty much when it comes to local news. Glenn Taylor, the owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves. I don't know if you have to own a pro sports franchise to also own a local newspaper, but in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, they also have been producing great work. They have a very robust newsroom, very robust local report. So those are a couple of cases where there are publications owned by wealthy people that have also made this pivot from print to digital and are growing at the same time. So, yeah,
I would
billionaires
also
can help, but it's not necessarily the answer.
Well, and I would also just say ownership by an individual, a wealthy individual is business as usual, right? Like, I mean, most of the outlets in the country going back 200 years have been owned by wealthy individuals. I mean, that was kind of like how it was until like the Aldens and Gatehouses of the world started buying up newspapers.
That's I haven't thought about it, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
to
one
that point,
local example was Sam Zell,
The
the Chicago Tribune.
Salzburgers in New York. I
Yeah,
mean,
and the look how the Sam Zell thing turned out. You know, not so great. Yeah.
yeah, I guess kind of to that point of layoffs, I guess I was curious also, have you looked at all at newsroom unionization and whether that impacts any of the layoffs? I know the Chicago Tribune Guild has been kind of pretty active, kind of protesting some of the things that Alden has done.
Yeah, there's no question that we've seen a burgeoning labor and unionization movement in local news in recent years. The Chicago Tribune is now unionized, and as somebody who worked at the Chicago Tribune a long time ago, um, uh, it was surprising to see, that even the Chicago Tribune became unionized. And it's also happening at startups, at relatively new news organizations. Really, it's happening kind of everywhere. And of course, we're in this time of economic crisis. It's totally understandable why employees would want to organize, and they are. And it is changing the dynamic of the relationship
but it
between.
doesn't prevent, right? There was a news outlet in Illinois, in Southern Illinois, that was completely unionized. The work labor was completely unionized, and it was bought by Paxton, and they were all laid off.
Yeah,
So
the Southern Illinoisan down in
that's,
Carnegie.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So it unfortunately doesn't prevent, but like it certainly can't hurt.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
I think we've got time for one or two more here. So, perhaps inevitable, but someone asked, um, what role will AI play in the future of local news? You mentioned the whole question of big tech kind of paying for the news that they use, and AI, I guess, is another frontier in that.
Yeah, a couple of quick answers to that. And I'm actually working with a colleague here on a report on the impact of AI on local news. And we've been talking to experts for that report. First of all, I think we're headed toward a really pivotal existential legal battle over AI and news. The New York Times recently filed suit about access to its content by AI platforms. I would not be surprised if local news organizations also file their own lawsuit or somehow get engaged in litigation. So I think we're in for a titanic legal battle over access to local news content by AI platforms, which is a big case. Look, AI, there are some ways where I think AI could be very beneficial to local news organizations, to some of the back office functions, to advertising departments in those areas. And I think it is going to be used to generate news stories. And it already has been in some places. And there was an example at Gannett where it had to walk back its use of AI in writing sports stories off of high school sports games. I think it's not quite there yet, but it's going to get there eventually, where it is able to generate accurate news and information. But it is going to fundamentally change the game.
Yeah, I mean, one really quick note to that. One of the things that would be something to watch out for would be if AI news stories start bringing in mis and disinformation, right? Because I don't know if there's quite the discretion or among the algorithms yet to discern what is from a legit news outlet and what's not. So, that would be another concern.
Yeah. Thank you both. I think we can do maybe just one very last question, which would be, what's the one thing that you would tell people to do to like support local news in their community?
Subscribe.
That was exactly what I was going to say. It's
Yeah.
easy. That's an
Subscribe
easy
or
one.
become a member. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
Pay for
so
your local
important.
news. Pay the reporters who are doing the work.
Cool. Okay, I think that that's all that we have time for. So thank you both again. This was an incredible presentation. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, and I hope folks will check out the website and the report in more detail. Josh, if we want to pull up the slide to just remind folks that they can hop on over to the post-presentation Zoom call.